Welcome to SEDF 704, Diversity in Adolescent Development. In this video, we'll be exploring how identity forms during adolescence and how that process is influenced by diverse factors like race, gender, sexuality, ability, and culture. Identity is one of the most complex and meaningful aspects of development, and understanding it is essential if we want to support all students, especially those navigating multiple social worlds. Let's begin with a simple but powerful question. Who am I and who am I becoming? These are the kinds of questions adolescents begin to ask in more complex and urgent ways as they grow. This process is known as identity formation, and it refers to the developmental journey through which individuals come to understand and define themselves over time. It includes values, beliefs, personality, social roles, and a sense of belonging. And while it evolves across the lifespan, it takes on particular intensity during adolescence. To understand identity, it's helpful to distinguish it from a related construct, self-concept. Self-concept refers to how a person thinks about and describes themselves, often in terms of traits, abilities, and roles. It includes statements like, I'm smart, I'm good at sports, or I'm the oldest in my family. It's largely cognitive and begins forming early in life. Identity, on the other hand, is more integrated and reflexive. It includes not only how we see ourselves, but also how we define our values, connect with social groups, and imagine our future selves. Identity is deeply tied to our sense of meaning, direction, and belonging. In adolescence, it becomes a central developmental task. As adolescents gain more advanced cognitive abilities, they begin to reflect on abstract questions about who they are and who they want to be. They become increasingly aware of how others perceive them and how those perceptions align or conflict with their own self-understanding. They also begin to feel greater pressure from family, peers, school, and society to define themselves, make commitments, and start shaping a future path. This stage of life is also when issues of diversity become especially salient. Factors like race, gender identity, sexual orientation, language background, socioeconomic status, and ability status all influence how adolescents form their sense of self. These identities do not exist in isolation. They intersect, and they shape how adolescents are treated, what roles are expected of them, and which pathways feel open or closed. Understanding identity formation in adolescence requires us to look at both the internal psychological journey and the external social context. In the rest of this video, we'll explore major developmental theories that help us explain how identity forms and why that process can look so different depending on adolescents' backgrounds and environments. Sigmund Freud was one of the first theorists to present a comprehensive theory of personality and development. His psychodynamic theory proposed that human behavior is largely influenced by unconscious drives and early childhood experiences. According to Freud, personality is structured around three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the primal instinctual part of the mind. It operates based on pleasure principle, seeking immediate gratification of desires and needs. The ego develops to mediate between the id and the real world. It operates on the reality principle, managing desires in socially acceptable ways. The superego represents internalized societal rules and moral standards. It develops later in childhood and serves as a counterbalance to the id by enforcing guilt and ideal behavior. Freud also proposed a series of psychosexual stages of development. The first stage is the oral stage. It begins at birth and lasts to approximately 1 year of age. Pleasure centers on the mouth. Sucking, biting, and breastfeeding are key activities. Fixations at this stage may relate to dependency on oral behaviors like smoking or nail biting. The anal stage emerges at about 1 year and lasts till about 3 years of age. Pleasure here is focusing on bowel and bladder control. Toilet training becomes a central task. Fixations here can lead to overemphasis of orderliness or messiness. The phallic stage emerges at about 3 years of age and lasts till about 6 years of age. Here, the pleasure zone shifts to the genitals. Children become aware of their bodies and begin to identify with same-sex parents. The Oedipus and Electra complexes arise here. The latency stage emerges at about age 6 and lasts to about 12 years old. During this time, sexual impulses are repressed. Focus shifts to developing skills, hobbies, and friendships. This is the time of social and intellectual development. Finally, the genital stage emerges at about 12 years and continues throughout the rest of the lifespan. Sexual impulses reawaken with puberty. Adolescents seek mature romantic relationships and begin to channel energies into intimacy, love, and productive work. And mature sexuality becomes the central concern. Freud believed that successful navigation of earlier stages was essential for healthy development in the genital stage. Unresolved conflicts from earlier stages could reemerge and interfere with forming mature relationships. So why study Freud? While many of his ideas have been challenged or revised, Freud laid the groundwork for the modern study of development. He introduced the concept that childhood experiences have lasting psychological effects and that unconscious motivations can influence behavior, ideas that remain foundational in psychology. That said, Freud is not widely used in adolescent education today because of his theories. First, they overemphasize sexuality and underemphasize cognitive, emotional, and social growth. They are not supported by empirical research. Also, they do not reflect the diversity of the adolescence experience, especially around gender, culture, and identity. Finally, they are less actionable for educators who need developmentally appropriate strategies grounded in social contexts. Still, Freud's contributions are historically important, and understanding his ideas help us appreciate how later theorists like Erikson and Marcia responded and built more inclusive, socially aware models of identity. Let's look at an example through the Freudian lens. Consider an adolescent who feels intense anxiety when beginning to date. Freud might interpret this as unresolved conflicts from the phallic or latency stage resurfacing, related to guilt, repression, or an unresolved Oedipal dynamic. Freud would not, however, offer tools for understanding how cultural values or peer expectations might have shaped this adolescent's anxiety. Now let's look at the work of Erik Erikson. Since particularly his theory of psychosocial development aligns with a humanistic perspective in psychology. He emphasized the importance of the individual's experiences and how they navigate social and cultural influences throughout their lives. Unlike the more deterministic Freudian approach, Erikson focused on the individual's agency and capacity for growth and positive development. He proposed 8 psychosocial stages across the lifespan, each defined by a central developmental conflict. Let's briefly examine each one of these 8 stages. The first stage is trust versus mistrust and occurs during infancy. In the first year of life, infants learn to trust their caregivers to meet their needs. Successful resolution fosters a sense of security. Failure may result in fear and suspicion. Erikson's second stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt, and occurs during toddlerhood. During this stage, toddlers learn to assert their independence by making choices. Encouragement leads to autonomy, while overly critical responses may result in doubt and shame. The next stage is initiative versus guilt, and it occurs in early childhood. Children begin to take initiative in planning activities and engaging with others. Support in this stage fosters purpose. Punishment or discouragement can lead to guilt. The next stage is industry versus inferiority, which happens during middle childhood. During this stage, School-aged children work towards mastery in academic and social tasks. Success in this stage builds a sense of competence. Failure during this stage can create feelings of inferiority. The fifth stage is identity versus role confusion and happens during adolescence. This is the critical stage for identity formation. Adolescents explore different roles and develop a sense of self. Failure to establish a stable identity can result in confusion, passivity, or identity foreclosure. Following adolescence, people enter the stage of intimacy versus isolation, and this happens during young adulthood. Young adults seek meaningful relationships and emotional intimacy. Success leads to strong social bonds. Failure may result in isolation and loneliness. The seventh stage happens in middle adulthood and is the generativity versus stagnation stage. During this stage, adults aim to contribute to society and support the next generation. Success brings a sense of purpose. Failure may result in stagnation and self-absorption. The last stage is integrity versus despair and happens in late adulthood. In later life, individuals reflect on their life with either fulfillment or regret. Favorable resolution leads to wisdom. Unresolved conflict leads to despair. Now let's focus more deeply on the adolescent stage, identity versus role confusion. In his 1968 book, Youth in Crisis, Erikson deepened his explanation of adolescence as a period where identity formation takes center stage. He framed the word crisis not as a breakdown, but as a critical developmental opportunity, an inner questioning of one's beliefs, goals, and values and roles. According to Erikson, adolescents face the task of integrating who they have been with who they hope to become, within a complex social structure that includes family, culture, peers, institutions, and history. Youth in Crisis also emphasized that the search for identity happens in specific historical and cultural contexts. Erikson pointed to major political and social movements of the time, such as the civil rights activism, and moments when youth were just not forming identities but redefining social roles. He acknowledged that identity can be influenced by broader factors like class, race, religion, and nationality, which either support or constrain self-exploration. This idea that identity formation is shaped both by internal conflict and external opportunity marks a turning point in developmental theory. Let's look at an example. In his book, Erikson discusses cases such as students protesting the Vietnam War, young adults struggling with cultural heritage, and individuals in vocational limbo, to show how adolescents' sense of self is shaped not only by personal choice, but by their ability to act meaningfully in society. A high school student who feels disconnected from both school and community may experience role confusion, not because of laziness, but because their environment fails to provide meaningful roles with which to identify. Let's look at a few examples. Consider a student who experiments with various extracurricular activities, explores political beliefs, and develops a personal moral code is engaging in healthy identity exploration. A teen who adopts a parental or cultural expectation without questioning it may experience foreclosure, a premature closure of identity development. Another adolescent may be pulled in multiple directions between family expectations and peer influences, and may delay commitment, leading to role confusion. Erikson viewed adolescence as a necessary period of experimentation, and he emphasized that resolving this stage successfully provides a strong foundation for later tasks, like forming intimate relationships and contributing to society. Importantly, he acknowledged that identity formation may take time and that it is shaped by multiple factors, like culture, history, and social expectations. James Marcia was a developmental psychologist who built directly on Erikson's work, but with one major goal in mind: to make Erikson's theories measurable. See, Erikson gave us the idea that adolescence is a time of identity crisis, a search for who we are and what we believe. But that idea, while powerful, was too broad to test scientifically. It was hard to observe or quantify. So Marcia asked, what does identity formation actually look like behaviorally? And how can we study it in real adolescence? He found two key components. First, exploration, actively thinking about and trying different roles, values, or goals. And second, commitment, making decisions and sticking to them, even if they evolve later. From these, Marcia proposed 4 identity statuses, not stages, because people don't move through them in a fixed order. Instead, they reflect different points in the identity process. Let's look at this 2x2 table, and we can discuss how James Marcia mapped out the 4 identity statuses using these 2 key dimensions, exploration and commitment. Across the top, you see exploration, ranging from low on the left to high on the right. Along the side, we've got commitment, from low at the bottom and high at the top. Let's walk through each quadrant. In the bottom left, where both exploration and commitment are low, this would be identity diffusion. This is the adolescent who hasn't really thought about who they are or what they want. They're not actively exploring, and they haven't committed to a particular path. Think, I don't know what I want to do, and I'm not too worried about it. In the top left, we have foreclosure. This is high commitment, but low exploration. This is a teen who's made a decision, but not because they've explored alternatives. Maybe they've accepted a role or identity handed to them by parents or culture without questioning it. Think, I'm going to be a lawyer because that's what my parents want me to do. On the right side, on the bottom, we see moratorium. This is high exploration but low commitment. This is an adolescent who is asking big questions, trying new things, but hasn't landed on a firm decision yet. Think, I'm thinking about going into medicine or art or maybe working abroad. I'm still figuring it out. I haven't made any decisions. Finally, in the top right, we reach identity achievement, where both exploration and commitment are high. This adolescent has asked the hard questions already. They've considered different possibilities and now feels confident in their choices. Think, I've explored a few majors, worked a few jobs, and I know what feels right for me now. Marcia's framework gave researchers a practical tool to assess where a young person might be in their identity journey and to recognize that the movement between statuses is normal and ongoing. Let's look at a few more examples. This is Jordan. Jordan is a 16-year-old who doesn't think much about their future. When asked about college or career plans, they shrug and say, I'll figure it out later. They're not exploring, and they haven't made any commitments. What is Jordan's identity status? What would Marcia say? Next, let's look at Maya. Maya is 17 and plans to take over her family's restaurant. She's never questioned this plan. It's just what's expected. She hasn't explored other paths or interests. She's committed, but only because that decision was made for her. What is Maya's identity status? And what would Marcia say about this? Let's look at Dylan. Dylan is 18 and he's exploring all kinds of possibilities. He's volunteering, joining clubs, and taking classes in different subjects, and questioning his religious upbringing. He hasn't made a firm decision yet, but he's in active exploration mode. What would Marcia say about him? Finally, Zara is 19 and recently decided to major in environmental science after exploring different areas. She's tried courses in biology, politics, and sociology, and after some soul searching, she chose a path that aligns with both her values and her interests. What identity status best describes Zara's experience? And what would Marcia say about that? Well, Marcia helped us understand the internal process of identity development, how adolescents explore and commit. His model doesn't fully account for the social environments that shape these choices. To understand why some adolescents explore more than others, or how their options are constrained or supported, we need to zoom out. Yuri Bronfenbrenner asked, what's going on around this person, and how does that environment shape who they become? He called this the ecological systems theory, and he described development as happening within a series of nested systems, like nesting Russian dolls, each system surrounding the next. Here's what each system includes. The microsystem is the closest layer. It includes immediate environments that adolescents interact with directly. Think family, school, friends, coaches, church groups. An example might be a teen with a caring teacher, and strong friendships might develop confidence and motivation. If those supports are missing, or if there's conflict, self-concept, the way that someone envisions themselves, and motivation may suffer. The next layer is the mesosystem. This layer is about how microsystems connect to one another. An example might be, does a student's family communicate well with their school? If so, that consistency might reinforce academic success. But if there's tensions between home and school, the adolescent may feel pulled in different directions. The next outer layer is the exosystem. This is a level of systems the adolescent does not directly interact with, but still affect them. An example might be a parent's stressful job, neighborhood violence, or school board's funding decisions all influence an adolescent's life, even though the teen isn't directly involved. The next layer is the cultural layer, the overarching norms, laws, beliefs, and values that make up social systems. An example might be society's views on gender roles, mental health, or race deeply affect what adolescents see as possible or acceptable for themselves. These values trickle down through all the other systems. The last, most outer layer is called the chronosystem. The chronosystem adds the element of time, how personal events in historical contexts and periods shape development. An example might be a child who moves cities during adolescence, or a teen growing up during a global pandemic or national protest movement. These unique historical experiences change how that person's identity unfolds. So what does this mean for identity? Bronfenbrenner shows us that identity is not just a personal decision. It's shaped by everything around the adolescent: who they live with, what schools they attend, what messages they hear from the media, what kind of policies or barriers exist in their community, what is valued or marginalized in their culture. Bronfenbrenner helps us recognize that identity formation is not a solitary process. Every adolescent is navigating an interplay between personal exploration with external forces, from a micro level family support to macro level structural inequality. If we want to understand adolescent identity, we have to ask what systems are supporting this young person and what systems may be limiting them. Now that we've explored how identity is shaped from the inside out, with Erikson's focus on developmental crisis, Marcia's emphasis on exploration and commitment, and Bronfenbrenner's systems of influence, let's put these ideas into action. We're going to look at a series of scenarios involving adolescents from diverse backgrounds across race, disability, and sexual orientation, and examine how identity formation is affected in each case. As we walk through these examples, we'll ask, how does this adolescent experience identity conflict? What kinds of exploration are possible or blocked? And which systems are helping or hurting their development? Our first scenario looks at a student with a physical disability. A teenager with a visible or invisible disability navigates school with limited accommodations. They are often excluded from physical activities, but they also have a strong bond with a mentor who encourages independence. Using Bronfenbrenner's theory, we can see how different environmental systems, microsystem to macrosystem, shape this adolescent's experience. At the microsystem level, interactions with peers, teachers, and the mentor directly impact self-esteem and agency. At the mesosystem level, the connection or disconnect between family, school staff, and healthcare professionals may either support or fragment this adolescence experience. At the exosystem level, the school's budget for accommodations and caregivers' workplace policies might affect their opportunities. At the macrosystem level, cultural assumptions about disability, like pity or empowerment, influence how the adolescent is perceived and treated. Finally, at the chronosystem level, changes in disability rights, like ADA enforcement, inclusive education movements, may increase long-term opportunity. Erikson would interpret this through the lens of identity and role confusion, focusing on how the adolescent is navigating their developing sense of self in response to social expectations. Erikson would say the adolescent might struggle with identity versus role confusion if they internalize stereotypes or are defined primarily by their limitations. Positive role models and inclusive settings allow the adolescent to form an identity built on strengths and values and not labels. Marcia would analyze this person's identity status by considering how much exploration and commitment they've engaged in so far. If they passively accept the identity that others assign them, they might be in foreclosure. If they reject limiting expectations and actively explore their capabilities and goals, they may move into a moratorium and potentially identity achievement. The next scenario concerns sexual orientation. A gay adolescent keeps their orientation secret at school due to fear of rejection. They have one close friend who knows, and they follow LGBTQ+ creators online. They dream of moving to a more accepted place after graduation. Using Bronfenbrenner's theory, we can see how different environmental systems, microsystem to macrosystem, will shape this adolescence experience. At the microsystem level, a lack of safety in peer and teacher interactions leads to social withdrawal. At the mesosystem level, conflict may arise between home values and school climate or online influences. At the exosystem level, local laws and media representation affect the adolescent's sense of what's possible. At the macrosystem level, heteronormative cultural norms and religious values shape what is acceptable. At the chronosystem level, growing public visibility and rights movements influence the timing and confidence of self-disclosure. Erikson would interpret this through a lens of identity and role confusion, focusing on how the adolescent is navigating their developing sense of self in response to social expectations. Erikson would say the adolescent faces role confusion as they navigate internal clarity and external risk. They may compartmentalize aspects of their identity in order to survive and feel safe. Identity development depends on access to affirming relationships and narratives. Finally, Marcia would analyze the adolescent's identity status by considering how much exploration and commitment they've engaged in so far. If they suppress their identity without questioning, they remain in diffusion or foreclosure. If they explore identity through private reflection and selective disclosure, they may be in moratorium. Coming out to supportive individuals and forming pride in their identity may lead to identity achievement. The last scenario focuses on diversity in terms of race and ethnicity. And just like the previous two scenarios, we're going to deconstruct it using the lenses of Bronfenbrenner, Erikson, and Marcia. In this scenario, a Black teen attends a predominantly white high school where they feel invisible. At home, their family emphasizes cultural pride and teaches them to expect racial bias. They begin questioning how to navigate both worlds. Using Bronfenbrenner's theory, we can see how different environmental systems, microsystem to macrosystem, shape this adolescence experience. At the microsystem level, school microaggressions versus home pride messages shape contrasting feedback loops. At the mesosystem, if parents and school staff are disconnected, the adolescent may feel culturally split. At the exosystem level, local demographics, neighborhood segregation, and teacher training policies are going to be important. At the macro system level, systemic racism and dominant narratives affect how racial identity is viewed and valued. Finally, at the chronosystem level, exposure to racial justice movements can validate and empower racial identity. Erikson would interpret this through the lens of identity and role confusion, focusing on how the adolescent is navigating their developing sense of self in response to these social expectations. The adolescent's experiences a heightened identity crisis, not just who they are, but how they fit in spaces that were not built for them. Successful identity formation involves integrating multiple aspects of identity without feeling pressured to code switch or erase parts of themselves. Marcia would analyze the adolescent's identity status by considering how much exploration and commitment they've engaged in thus far. If they ignore or reject their racial identity, they may be in diffusion. If they adopt a single identity in response to external pressure, for example, I'm just like everybody else, they may be in foreclosure. Exploring cultural heritage, activism, and representation may reflect moratorium. If they exhibit pride and ownership of their racial identity, this would indicate identity achievement. In this lecture, we focused on identity formation in adolescence, what it is, why it matters, and how leading developmental theories help us understand it. We explored how adolescents begin to define who they are through exploration and commitment, while also responding to roles, messages, and constraints around them. Using the lenses of Erikson, Marcia, and Bronfenbrenner, we looked at how identity is shaped not just by internal development, but by social systems and cultural expectations. We applied these theories to real-life scenarios involving race, disability, and sexual orientation, and saw how identity development varies depending on the opportunities, barriers, and supports available to each adolescent. In our next lecture, we'll shift our focus to biological and cognitive development, examining how physical growth and changes in thinking during adolescence also drive differences in behavior, learning, and self-understanding. These changes add another layer to how we understand diversity in adolescent experiences, especially those in the classroom. Thanks for spending this time with me exploring how psychological theory and diversity shape adolescent development. If you're in the course, make sure to check the syllabus and weekly announcements for updates and assignments. If you're just visiting, thanks for stopping by. I hope you'll check out other videos in this playlist or elsewhere in the Stats with Torres channel. Wishing you the best in your educational pursuits. Until next time, ciao!